I wanted to talk a little bit about why I'm actually doing research on warehousing and supply chain logistics. First, explaining, for those of you that don't know, the field of city and regional planning. There is a School of City and Regional Planning on campus. The larger field is really focused on creating quality places for people to live and higher standards of living. In the main traditional field, the main subfields within it are environmental planning, transportation planning, housing, land use planning. Land use planning is a very key part of our field. We're very spatially oriented. And economic development planning. And economic development planning is my area of specialization. And within that, I'm very focused on how to improve economies, what's happening with the labor force, what industrial restructuring is doing to affect the prospects for quality living and quality jobs in places. And I focus on it from the aspects of new development, but also very much for redevelopment. And that is something that I'll mention later on because that's part of what I think is so intriguing about the rise, the way in which e-commerce is affecting the supply chain logistics field and what it means for a different kind of space, the space in the exurbs of a metro area, in the suburbs, and the space within the inner city, the last mile problem. So just to kind of give you a little introduction there. So telling you right there about that, focused on particularly labor and spatial implications of the shifts in supply chain logistics responding to e-commerce. The built environment component of that is why I'm talking about warehousing. And then I'm doing also research. I have a grant from the National Science Foundation National Robotics Initiative to look at the adoption of robotics within manufacturing and how that's affecting local economies and local workforces. So there's a key part of how I moved into thinking about this was the aspects of automation that are occurring in warehouses and what the real uptake of robots will be and how that will affect work in warehouses. But before I proceed, I really want to step back for a second and talk to you about economic development, because I do economic development planning, and there's this much broader field of economic development. We are here at Georgia Tech in an Economic Development Institute. It's one of the reasons I have found my career here to be so exciting. Many of the innovations, the research that's occurring here will translate into new industries, new firms, and new jobs of the future, right? And then we have synergy over in Technology Square where all of the state level economic development activity is. And so there's this broader field, and the field defines itself in terms of what it does, basically, as the slide implies here, as creating wealth and also creating jobs. Particularly in political circles, we'll talk about jobs because jobs are attached to workers and workers are voters. So, and essentially the view is that economic growth equals economic development. Within planning, because we are very concerned about the spatial aspects as well as the human aspects in terms of who wins and who loses in the economic development process, and can we change that? Can we minimize the adverse effects and prepare people for economic change, industrial change, which is always occurring? We make a distinction, and the distinction also responds back to some of the things. There's many, of course, positive things that come from traditional economic development, but we also have the things that we need to address, such as climate change, which I like Thomas Friedman's phrase, global weirding, because lots of people will say, well, how can Earth be getting warmer, the general public, when we're having unprecedented snows, et cetera, and things like that. So the global weirding, which it has been scientifically shown, we do expect to have more extremes of all kinds of climate. We have our carbon emissions that are a byproduct of our economic development that are leading to this. And we have devastating impacts on national and local economies from the climate change that's occurring. And again, planning's focused on these particular communities, et cetera. So we're very concerned about that. We also have the issue of sprawl. We talk a lot in our field about urban sprawl, and then, as I'll refer to later, there's a concept being talked about in terms of logistics sprawl, how the reconfiguring of the logistics industry is contributing to sprawl in metropolitan areas, and there are negative impacts of that. There are positive impacts of the location of the activity in terms of creating jobs and new economic activity for outlying communities. But we are increasing carbon emissions in that process. We are consuming greenfield land that can never be turned back into greenfield lands, and so we need, and there are environmental implications from some of those aspects. And then the other part of traditional economic development that's really critical right now, and you hear a lot of discussion about it, is that recent trends, recent industrial restructuring have really generated a process where we have a growth in our low-wage workforce, which is not something that we think of as advancing economic development. And we have growing inequality, and it's been a major theme in political circles and in policy circles for quite a while now, the growing concern over that. So that's without paying attention to other factors. If you just are focusing on wealth creation and job creation, then you aren't addressing these issues. So from a planning perspective, economic development is more than economic growth, job, and wealth creation. It actually is something that is achieved when a community's standard of living can be preserved and increased through a process of human and physical development based on principles of equity and sustainability. So that's the lens through which economic development planning work occurs. And so our goal is to have a minimum standard of living for all that increases over time, or else we're not advancing. That reduces inequality. We don't suggest that it's completely eliminated, because you want to be able to have merit and incentives for innovation and creating new activities and just rewarding people for their hard work or their brilliance. But there are things, aspects of traditional economic development that have had negative impacts on different demographic groups, and we want to reduce those impacts and make a more level playing field. And then there are spatially defined groups. We have a lot of discussion going on right now about the urban and rural divide and how critical that is getting. So that's one aspect of it. There's the central city and the suburb, and there are different aspects of central city all around Midtown where we're in a major growth boom, but we have many parts of the city that aren't that, and all over the country you find that. So we're concerned about that as well. And we want to promote sustainable resource use and production, and maybe even create new jobs and economic activity from finding out new ways to be sustainable. Okay, so introduction to my field and why I have the audacity to be studying your field. And then my research focus is exploring the urban trends in logistics and warehousing, really thinking about supply chain management, focusing a lot on warehouse automation and robotics, as I mentioned earlier. Why? E-commerce in particular, because this phenomenon is driving so much change, which I don't have to tell you folks, but it's driving a lot of change in the kinds of things that we're focused on in economic development planning. So there are implications for central cities and suburbs and exurbs out of the growth of e-commerce and the changes in land use, transportation, and other aspects to support that. And there are also economic development implications about how will the number and quality of jobs change through e-commerce. There's a lot of attention focused on right now on the lowering of the quality of jobs and as a result of e-commerce, and we'll talk about that. This, I know you know, which is what is the transforming logistic industry. But the e-commerce has been made possible, of course, by the growth of the information economy, but also by very, very efficient supply chains. So we have, in our current political climate, a lot of retrenching on trade liberalization, and that raises the questions about what kinds of impacts that will be placing on the economic development. And what are the effects of the tariffs and trade wars, where we don't have the data yet, but that could be while I'm trying to study this industry, it could be something that's sort of moving the industry or shifting it in a way that's hard to track. So I want to start by the fact that prior to this period that we're in right now, and this retrenching, we did have a long period of expanding globalization, global economies, and really driven in many ways by consumerism. These are the stats for the world, that 57.5% of the world's GDP is based off of the consumer economy. Then beyond that, in the US, we're the highest in terms of the portion of our economy that's based on consumers, and that's close to 70%. And what will happen there in terms of other forces that are happening and suggestions of global retrenching and the decline in the global economy that will accompany that. So here is just a statistic on the growth of e-commerce as a share of retail. And in the third quarter of 2018, it accounted for just under 10% of all sales that are occurring in the US. They were $130.9 billion, which was an increase of 3.1% from just the previous quarter, and it was an increase of 14.5% from a year earlier. So very fast growth going on in e-commerce. So warehouse space is, of course, the big thing is that accompanying the growth of e-commerce has to be the growth of warehousing, because we have so many products that are coming into the country or that we're creating that people are purchasing, and they are not purchasing them as much from brick and mortar stores. So it's very hard to get data on warehouses. This particular figure here is a commercial building survey that stopped at 2012. We don't actually collect, publicly collect, as we do with labor data and income data and the census data, data on our built environment. It's a very frustrating thing for someone who focuses on these issues. But what this shows us, and the trends are, I think, occurring, continuing to occur, is that warehouse growth doesn't happen equally across size categories. The largest warehouse sizes have been growing, and they're growing. Many of them are larger than any of this was being projected, and that the smallest categories were growing, which makes you think about the need for warehouse space within the central cities to accommodate the goods that are coming in and to address the last mile problem. So, but we do know on the large category size that Amazon added 59 warehouses since 2013, ranging from 420,000 square feet to almost 1.3 million square feet. Enormous amount of square footage being added in warehousing. And here's sort of an example. I just wanted to not have it all be Amazon. So here's one of the big distribution centers from Walmart that actually went into Florida more in the early 2000s, and so a lot of them are even bigger nowadays. But if you look at it in this sort of rural landscape, it's right next to a highway exit, of course, but it is a very large footprint. So that is something to keep in mind. I'll reference that again a little bit later. And then these are just some recent statistics that are showing how the height of buildings, warehouse buildings, is increasing, and that we've added, in Atlanta alone, we added almost 55 million square feet of warehouse space in the 5-year period between 2012 and 2017. And I don't know about you, but when I look outside on the edges of the metro area, then especially in the southern part of the metro area, the land clearing going on and the massive warehouses going up makes this figure probably much higher now. So the two recent developments relate to this growth in e-commerce, as I implied. One, the growth of the distribution centers, and there's just a small graphic of that. But they're different from traditional warehouses in that they are points of transition and throughput rather than storage. And they tend to be in major population centers because that's where they need to make deliveries to customers. But they can also be waypoints between major population centers. And then the other side is the notion of trying to meet the increased activity in warehouses, and to do so competitively is to what extent are warehouse robots going to be adopted. This is, of course, the Amazon robot, which is the Kiva robot. Amazon actually bought the Kiva company and began using mobile warehouse robots in 2014. They say that they have about 100,000 of them in use as of the middle of last year. So these robots, what they're doing is basically moving pallets around, or these large shelving systems for them. The implications out of the warehouse changes from e-commerce is that, as I mentioned, there's e-commerce is driving the automation in the warehouses, and it's driving the need for new buildings to accommodate automation, those higher ceilings. Right now, the recent statistic that just came out this week is that we now have in this country the lowest industrial vacancy rate ever recorded, and that's because of the demand for warehouse space. But it is, as I mentioned earlier, leading to logistics sprawl. So if going back to that image of the Walmart in rural Florida, one mega warehouse can equal 22 football fields. So that's an enormous amount of greenfield consumption and new road infrastructure to support it. There's a rule of thumb that's been suggested from CBRE that $1 billion in e-commerce revenue requires 1.25 million square feet of distribution center space for effective management. So that's another aspect of what's driving that. So it's changing very much the landscape in metro areas, having a significant impact on it. And then my question here, thinking about long-term economic development and the need to maintain places when you have major industrial shifts, is what will happen if something changes and the demand for these warehouses goes down. I'm referring here to the dead big box problem, which you all may be familiar with, that routinely big box stores, they last about 15 years and then they close them. And the community is left with this huge albatross that is very difficult to reposition or resell. And it's, once you start to have vacant buildings like that sit for a long time, it typically begins a cycle of decay because it has negative effects on surrounding properties. So would these warehouses end up being a monster version of the dead big box problem? And if we think about that now, are there ways in which maybe they could ultimately be designed that they're more easily reconfigured for something else, which is what the trend had been for the big box problems, when some communities realized they needed to think about this proactively. So I want to shift now and talk about logistics employment. So one question that we've raised, I have 3 PhD students working with me on my grant, is whether logistics in some ways is becoming the new manufacturing. This graph here, you can't see all the small numbers, but it shows not only has logistics industry employment been growing steadily from just under 4 million in 2002 to over 4.7 million in 2016. The interesting thing is that the growth is exactly equal to the percentage that manufacturing shrank. So we have fewer manufacturing jobs, and we've continued this decline in manufacturing jobs since the 1970s. But we have this pretty significant growth going on in logistics jobs. And that over the Great Recession, so logistics is the green line on the bottom, it showed much less volatility than manufacturing did. So that's a positive aspect for a community, that they may be less impacted by the winds of a recession. Let's see, this is not, okay, there we go. All right, so this the left chart repeats the graphic we just saw so that you can more easily compare it with the right side, which shows that average annual wages in logistics have fallen further behind the US as a whole and the manufacturing and the construction sectors. So the manufacturing, see if I can get this to click. I'm trying to pull my data for you. Manufacturing workers still receive a pretty good wage at about $65,000 a year. Construction workers about $60,000 a year, and logistics is down at $50,000 a year. So on the one hand, the stability is great, but on the other hand, these are lower wage jobs, the kinds of things that are contributing to the fact that 40% of all jobs in the US are now considered low wage. And then here, just thinking about logistics relative to total US employment. The logistics industry is a large and growing employer nationwide, as we've talked about. Its growth rate is significantly higher than the US as a whole. While total US employment grew by 11% between 2006 and 2018, the logistics sector grew by just under 20%. So that is one thing to be considering in terms of its adopting a greater share of US jobs. And then here is an interesting phenomenon too. So in terms of earnings, logistics workers earn more on average than workers in many other sectors on a weekly basis, but they earn less hourly. So what this means is that they're working more hours, and the jobs tend to fall on, they have low skill and education requirements, but they require significant time commitments, and the workers don't have a lot of control over their time commitments whatsoever. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So essentially, the work has been characterized as precarious work. It has low wages because of those low wages, but the higher weekly earnings just because of the demands of them having to be there when they do have work. But it's unstable work arrangements. Much of the work is handled through specialized employment agencies that are supplying workers to the warehouses. And so they're temporary workers that work at will, and they often they'll ramp up during the holiday time, and then they'll lose their jobs afterwards. So the fact that it's temporary employment means that their annual incomes may not be very high, even though the weekly wages are high when they get the work. So there is this notion of underemployment, that they have difficulty getting full-time, year-round jobs in the logistics and warehouses, which leads to economic insecurity, difficulty in maintaining a decent standard of living, paying for house mortgages and car payments, etc. Through the temporary agencies, they receive no employer-provided benefits, and benefits themselves add as much as 30 to 50% to your salary. And then they have, because they're temporary workers, very little in the way of legal and sort of regulatory protections. So that's why in many, the work in logistics is called precarious. So why are companies using a precarious work model? Well, in many ways, they don't have a choice, at least at this point, because they're dealing with very strong competitive pressures. The global competition has increased greatly. And Walmart and Amazon are, because of their size, smaller firms can't compete as well in many ways. So there are vertically disintegrated organizational structures occurring as a way to be more cost efficient, and so they have to do that in order to stay competitive. They outsource a lot of activities that used to occur within their firms because of this pressure, and they focus on their core competencies. The outsourcing also has been critiqued as that which shields companies from all kinds of liability and issues. And as a result of all this, the job quality in logistics has eroded because of these kinds of pressures. So it's kind of a vicious cycle in terms of responding to the increased competition that comes in a global economy where we have very efficient supply chains. The same thing is happening in trucking, which is the other key job category that we've been looking at. The short-haul trucking in particular, which is called drayage, not sure why, but maybe one of you folks would have a good explanation for why it's called that, is particularly impacted by the shifts in the logistics industry being fueled in many ways by e-commerce. So there are small trucking firms that have to compete for shipping contracts, and they don't use their own trucks. They use independent contractors that have their own trucks, at least their own trucks. These drivers or truck owner-operators are classified as independent contractors, but the phrase here is misclassified because they aren't independent. They have one firm. They're not allowed to drive for other firms, so they don't have the independency that would allow them to be more competitive. And what's happened is that they're not paid by the hour. They're paid by the trip. So they're not compensated for long delays at terminals or being caught in traffic, so their hourly wage can go down and as a result of that. And they have to pay all the cost of vehicle ownership and operation. So it's a pretty difficult situation that they have been put in, again, responding to the ways in which these competitive pressures are playing out. So same thing, we have these externalization of labor costs from lead firm vertical disintegration, deteriorating job quality, increased job insecurity. Many of the workers are the picker-packers in the warehouses, and thinking back about robotics and the adoption of that, and it's unclear, what the impacts are, but the picking is the real challenge in robotics in terms of creating robots that can pick well. And then this is supposed to be more, packing's supposed to be more, the phrase I wanted in there was sort of moving the materials, and you saw what the Kiva robots are doing. That part of it has been resolved. But that is a proprietary robot to Amazon, so how it will diffuse to the rest of the warehouse sector is unclear. So then the other thing just to think about in terms of statistics on all of this, because normally, economic theory tells us that if you increase productivity, you increase wages, right? That's been our long standard, that's standard labor economics. But what this is showing you is that the weight of goods in freight had a 6% change between 2007 and 2013. The value had an 8% increase. So the goods being shipped are more valuable or cost more. And this is controlling for inflation. Employment only grew by 1%, even though you had that increase in the freight weight and value that was occurring. And most significantly at the bottom, the logistics average annual wage actually declined by almost 1%. So there's something there that is not working with what traditional economic labor theory suggests. But it does suggest that the workers themselves are becoming more productive. They're just not being compensated for the productivity. So, and then it leads to a lot of questions about what the impacts of robotics will be. Here is a conveyor belt that's being that for a fully automated Shanghai warehouse that's in concept or being produced rather, fully automated. Pretty much, says that you might have 4 or 5 employees occurring in the warehouse. There's a lot of skepticism about whether that will occur on a wide scale because it may be that you have very narrow select products that are being handled in those, and so it'd be more of a specialized warehouse. But the long-term notion, the question is whether the introduction of robots may reduce the number of jobs in a warehouse, but would they change the quality of those jobs? And would it lead to higher skills being used with them, and in turn, would that result in higher standards of living and the better wages that are associated with that? And that's something that we hope we might get to do some research on. So then last part I want to go to is to thinking about metropolitan impacts, because that's my field again. The metro area is really where, well, it's certainly where the majority of all U.S. population lives. It's more higher percentage of economic activity comes out of that. There are many people across the globe that say that it's our cities, our major cities, that are the source of innovation, change, and that they are the drivers, not nations. There are those that argue that it's really the cities and not nations that are the major drivers of the globe and the powerhouses of the globe. So it's a really interesting thing from that aspect. So in order to take a look at a little bit about what's happening with logistics in metro areas, very difficult to get the data on this, but what we did do is shift to a data source that's called real-time labor market information. So what's happening is that a firm, Burning Glass Technologies out of Massachusetts, 365, 24/7 collects all the job ads that are listed via the web in the country. And they started doing this for job placement firms and labor market planners, but they're allowing researchers to get access to the data. And what's great about it is that it has the name of the company, you have the name of the job, you have the skills that they're looking for, you have the geocoding for that. And so we, through our NSF grant, were able to muster up the funds to buy this data set, which is quite pricey. And then we went in and pulled out logistics jobs for the top metropolitan areas in logistics that we identified, and the way in which we identified them is parallel to how others are identifying the top logistics areas. So we focus specifically on warehousing and truck driver jobs, and what you're seeing here is this is not people in the jobs, it's job ads. So what is the demand for this logistics labor in these metropolitan areas? It is, if you will, kind of a future indicator of what's happening in the industry. So here you can see that the biggest demand for logistics jobs was heavy and tractor-trailer truck drivers, and the second biggest demand, which is this green on the pie, and then the second biggest demand was for laborers and freight stock and material handlers. So those are your biggest categories for which job advertisements are being created, but then you'll see the rest of the categories there. I won't go over them in detail, and then here we see there's a time series that we were able to create. We went from 2007 to 2010 because the Burning Glass data is not really reliable in those middle years because of the national recession. But we are able to get a time series of pre-recession and post-recession. 2007 is the first point, 2010, and then annually from 2010 to 2017. And just to show you sort of the demand in these metro areas, the top metro areas I mentioned, or said that we are focusing on. And the interesting thing, which we don't have an explanation for, is sort of the major sort of peak and then sort of decline going on with heavy and tractor-trailer truck drivers. If anybody has a thought about that, does that suggest a shift to rail or some kind of aspect there? And why would that be the case? I'd love your insights. So the other thing we wanted to look at, these are the top MSAs that we found that had logistics activity, but we wanted to know how specialized the economies were in logistics in these areas that have the highest levels of logistic activity. And so here, this indice on the right in the table is called a location quotient. It's just an index of specialization. It's whether your metropolitan area has a higher percentage of workers in trucking or with warehouse workers than the national average. And then you're more specialized than the nation as a whole. And so you can see there that Atlanta is definitely more specialized. Chicago, New York, by sheer size, has a lot of the industry, but it's not as specialized in logistics as other cities. And then Dallas is quite specialized. Houston's kind of a weird phenomenon because it's considered a top logistics center, but it's really transporting oil and gas, so it's very much not as focused on warehouse workers and those kinds of things. And then here's simply a list of the skills that are demanded in the warehouses. And forklift operators, number one, physical demand skills, being able to handle 12 hours a day running back and forth in warehouses with products and being on your feet all day. That's the other biggest characteristic. So and that's a comparison of the US with the top 6 MSAs, so I won't go into much detail about that. So in terms of whether automation is going to eliminate jobs, there's been a lot of talk. I know you've seen this in the news about trucks and truck driving. You know, we're going to have automated trucks and we're going to eliminate the largest employment category in the US, which is truck drivers, if you didn't know that already. So, they're perceived as the most under threat because of self-driving vehicle technology, but there's some very good work done by some economists in the Census Bureau that say the potential displacement is not straightforward and often overestimated. And that's something that will be something I'll go into in a little bit more. So the truck driving that they analyzed, and this is Gittleman and Monaco, they analyzed the three primary truck driving occupations: drivers, sales workers, heavy and tractor trailer truck drivers. That's the traditional long haul driving. The first one, driver sales workers, is much more what you would think of as a last mile delivery or delivery vans, etc. And then the last category, light truck or truck delivery services drivers, are local deliveries, usually in vans, but it excludes UPS or FedEx. And so there are 3 occupations of truck driving that these 2 economists looked at. They constitute 3 million jobs, of which 1.7 million are heavy truck drivers. And then they talked about what they did was a very careful analysis of the skills required in those occupations, from having a commercial driving license, being able to handle hazardous materials, all the way down to your communication skills. And they had an occupational requirements survey that they were analyzing that asked employees to generate task lists for their jobs without predefined categories. They analyzed the text of these lists for heavy truck drivers, and these numbers are the percentage of tasks here, are on the bar chart here. These numbers are the percentage of task lists that each task category appeared on, suggesting that heavy truck drivers perform a significant amount of non-driving work. Over 80% of the total task list for individual truck drivers mentioned at least some form of non-driving work. So the point being that while their autonomous vehicles would displace drivers in some ways, it's also likely to change the nature of many current driving occupations and shift responsibilities to different tasks. It's unlikely that in the near term all 3 million truck drivers will be displaced, although from some of the national media you would be thinking that was the case. And they also looked at the issue of first and last mile aspects of trucking, and they'll be very difficult to automate. In some ways, it's analogous to flying, where most of a flight, if you think about it for pilots, is automated, but not the takeoff and the landing. So there are two critical aspects of that. So the level of automation also, if any of you have been looking at that for being able to use these driverless trucks once they're developed, is going to be heavily dependent on whether we have the appropriate infrastructure for the use of them. So dedicated lanes, et cetera. And that's going to require infrastructure investment, and that's going to require political action. So, and then there's been some Teamster pushback on autonomous truck driving, where they're trying to limit the amount of freight, the weight of freight in autonomous vehicles that would allow the need for truck drivers to be there for anything weighing 10,000 pounds or more. So essentially, on the autonomous truck driving aspect, we should probably expect a slow uptake on that, despite what we've been hearing in the news. The long haul to suburban distribution centers is probably the most feasible, but there are institutional infrastructure requirements, as I mentioned, and then there are some serious institutional barriers that occur at the moment. And if you're looking for sort of thinking about drones being part of the monitoring of the autonomous trucks, we have lots of privacy and security restrictions that have to be worked out for that. And so just quickly, a last point about getting to the city on this. So I've mentioned several times we have last mile delivery issues, and something happened to that was perfectly fine on my slide beforehand. And anyway, that was showing you a locker in an urban area, in a neighborhood. So we have the notion of we're going back to small urban distribution in many ways, and how do we do that, and what kinds of forms are going to be most efficient for that. From a sustainability perspective, how do you do that and not add to traffic congestion and resulting emissions and other aspects? So there are hazards involved in e-commerce, last mile deliveries, and growth in that sector, which we need to be thinking about. There are millions of additional parcels for home and business delivery that will occur as opposed to restocking a store. There's the expectation of immediate or two-day delivery, which has pretty significant environmental cost that some of the environmental economists are tracking these days. There's also additional delivery-related congestion, increased emissions, more wear on roads with more trucks delivering. There's the issue of final delivery completion and whether repeated delivery attempts are going to further add to congestion and emissions. And there are other things like theft of packages left unattended. There's a lot of expense involved in working out all these issues. A potential counteraction to rising VMT and emissions from increased last mile traffic is the growth in use of electric vehicles. Here are some UPS electric trucks. I think Europe is quite a bit ahead of us on the use of all of this, but hopefully we will move more towards that in the US. But, and UPS has multiple electric vehicle startup partnerships. FedEx and DHL are using electric delivery vans, and FedEx is also buying Tesla semi-trucks. So maybe we can work and have some real positive aspects on lowering the congestion that is potential from the last mile delivery. The other thing that's intriguing as a planner, again, thinking about space and the reuse of buildings, is the increased demand for smaller urban core warehouse space, which has to occur to accommodate all of the growth in e-commerce. Can we reuse vacant industrial properties for something that is a job-producing activity as opposed to another conversion to a trendy restaurant or a neighborhood? And are we making sure that we save some of the industrial property, because so much of that land has been converted to other uses, and Atlanta's a great example of this. But we're shortchanging ourselves on an economic activity if we don't think about some of this. So there's that aspect, and then there are alternatives, of course, to click and pick or click and collect at traditional retail stores for ways to pick up products, so the stores themselves in a way become a kind of a warehouse. The automated customer package pickup and drop-off centers in neighborhoods. We have our own Amazon one here at Georgia Tech. Interesting thought about whether the rideshare companies can also become product deliverers as well, which might give those workers a more constant source of income. And then, of course, the drone and robot industry. So here's just a picture of sort of situations in New York where the Amazon lockers are going up, and we'll have our own little maps of these. They can be inside stores as well. We already are seeing that here. And then this key effort here on robotics, which it looks a little awkward, but they're moving closer to being able to have robot dogs. This is called the robot dog, delivering your packages. So final thoughts. I wanted to recap this traditional economic development versus sustainable local economic development. So going beyond economic growth, which is job creation, wealth creation, to economic development that is thinking about the quality of jobs, minimizing inequalities or reducing at least inequalities between demographic groups, such as the very low wage warehouse worker that is also a temporary worker and quite vulnerable in many ways. Spatially defined groups, what's happening in the exurbs versus the central city, ultimately down the road thinking about what this means for rural areas, and that it promotes and encourages sustainable resource use and production. And my big question, which I'd love to hear some of your perspectives on, is can we shape e-commerce driven changes to logistics to promote more sustainable economic development in terms of the built environment, in terms of reuse of industrial properties, in terms of minimizing environmental impacts, and in terms of logistics work and whether we can upgrade through combining robots with workers the jobs that remain and reduce inequality that way. So can we reduce precariousness, increase wages and employment security? And just time for questions and discussion. And the Donald being thrilled with the big truck that came to the White House with the Teamsters in his first year. So.
Do you have any questions?
Yeah, oh, right behind.
What about, you mentioned about the sustainability, right, in terms of carbon emissions, and also when you think of supply chain, I think it has to be efficient and working, right? Because right now, a lot of this new e-commerce, things doesn't work the same way. Is anybody looking into that?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
So what I'm saying, the e-commerce is not very sustainable in terms of
Right.
the environment.
Are you talking about the packaging, for example?
No, yeah, packaging one of them, but also the traditional ways, there are less ways in terms of supply chain.
Right.
Versus e-commerce, there are more ways to go around it and more carbon footprint.
Yes, well, and I've talked a fair amount about the carbon footprint. I didn't bring up the packaging thing. I think that's really important, and I don't know I don't know who's looking at that, because you probably all have the same experience. You order something from Amazon and one little thing comes in an enormous box, or you order several things at the same time, and rather than it all coming in one box, you get several boxes. And then what do we do with this? We have very poor recycling in our city and in the state of Georgia. I've done a lot of work in the past on material reuse and recycling, and we're just way behind a lot of other places. So there's economic activity that could come out of that. Maybe there's biodegradable packaging material, more of it that could be used as fertilizer, or that's the trend that happened in fast food delivery, or fast food packaging rather. So that's something that's a possibility. But it's an important, legitimate question. So, but you could have jobs created out of all that too, and new firms and new businesses. So, yeah. So, any other? Yeah.
I'm just curious. The data that you presented relative to wages for logistics, warehouse, and transportation related jobs, does that data include both hourly employees plus salary, or is it just one of the just hourly, or what's the proper assumption?
I'd have to go back and, whoops, I better move it over here. So I'd have to go back and look at the data source. It depends. The workers, the logistics workers, it's probably by, when you look at job category, some of them are hourly and some of them are going to be salaried, which are often the higher level ones, right? But as I was mentioning, the truck drivers themselves are being paid by the trip, and the logistic workers are being paid by the hour. But I forgot to mention this one thing, which is really significant. The staffing agencies often take as much as a half of the wages of the warehouse worker for the commission for getting them the job. So these low wages already, which may be running $9, $7 to $13, they're only getting half of that without benefits.
Just an hypothesis, perhaps for you to consider
Mm-hmm.
as you pursue future grants and stuff on this same topic. From my own industry experience, I would contend that the percentage of jobs that are salaried versus hourly, that the percentages are over time are changing somewhat from the standpoint of as the logistics process gets more automated,
Mm-hmm.
require more people in the workforce to do knowledge jobs.
Yes, you're
that
absolutely right.
More positions that were hourly are now becoming salary. I don't have any data to support this. It's
Mm-hmm.
just exponential, observation, and it's logical.
Yeah,
So
it's
I think that depending on how you're looking at the wage data, if you're only looking at the lowest end of the value chain, with the people that are doing hand-touch labor on picking goods off shelves and stuff, versus looking at logistics and warehousing holistically,
mm-hmm.
it could change some of those conclusions about what things are doing trend-wise as far as compensation. So anyway,
Yeah,
just
it definitely does. There is this, what we call the skill bias in wage compensation and changes. So we find in our manufacturing research, that's what we found, that the wages are going up. We actually, in the metro areas, haven't found in our modeling that the employment went down very much, because it's different kinds of employment associated with advanced manufacturing, and it requires higher skill levels, so good salaries there. There's that potential in warehousing, although the scale of the low cost or low wage labor is much bigger. But there is that potential, and that's what I was trying to allude to a little bit about. We're going to have fewer jobs there. I think that's inevitable, and I don't think that's necessarily bad, as long as there can be better quality jobs that remain there. And critically, and this is kind of going beyond probably any of your interest, we get much better at retraining and workforce development in this country, which we are really poor on. So those are other bigger aspects of work that I look at and do. And there's a new 3-volume series of books that's just come out of the Federal Reserve System. I've got a section that I organized for that, really focusing on these critical issues. So.
Any other
maybe if I turn this.
So, is there any data that shows people are looking into either making warehouses vertical or probably taking buildings that are already zoned for mixed-use space and incorporating some type of micro warehousing within those locations?
I don't have any data on it, but I think that that's likely to happen, and that would be really interesting. It goes back to sort of this locker aspect, or even just on a much smaller scale, helping the maker movement and the small manufacturers that are developing in urban areas now that are going back into inner cities. Of course, they left long ago and manufacturing itself did, but the scale of manufacturing in many ways is getting smaller. And so if you want to have that kind of activity in your city, and we need diversified economies, right? We can't all be analysts and restaurant workers, right? So, or medical, that's the other thing, so everything medical. We need diversified economies. That's what gives you the greatest resiliency in your economy and offers the greatest opportunities. And so I think there are some intriguing things about that, but there's no data on it yet. And that's going back to that goes back to what I said at the beginning about we don't actually keep publicly collected data on building structures. The kind of work that I do has to rely on the industrial real estate companies being willing to share their data, which can be quite expensive. Other ways you can get some data, I've done this for the city of Atlanta with my researchers for a research project on resilient water infrastructures. We literally got all the building and tax parcel data from the tax assessor. And so we could analyze where industrial was and what size the buildings were and what age they were. And you can play with some things there. But you have to get that data and then put it together in the right framework to answer some of those questions with a lot of what we call in planning windshield surveying accompanying it. You literally drive around once you identify these potential buildings. So, yeah.
For the automation, obviously there's a trade-off. We need to go buy all these assets and need people to maintain the assets. The net benefit, like where is the biggest benefit been seen with automation? Is it variance or your overall throughput being reduced?
That, I would think you would be more able to answer. What do you think?
It's mostly efficiency in terms of the most costly in order picking is always manpower. So the drive now is to try to see if we can get away the workers from doing too much of order picking. So that's why you get the robots that are going to bring the stuff to the people so that they focus just on doing the perceived added value version. That's mostly where it's done.
Oh, okay. So and then you still need staff to maintain the robot. So
Exactly. So that's
trade-off.
That's an example of upskilling. Is that, maybe I should just take this off. Is that?
It's for the recording.
Oh, okay. Anyway, that's an example of upskilling. There may be fewer jobs, but you have to have technicians that maintain the robots, depending on the quality of the robots, et cetera. And hopefully they'll be inside the firm. The other aspect of the robotics industry is you have the makers of the robots, but then you have this group called the integrators that put together robotic systems, and they're also often involved in sort of the repair or reconfiguring the robot. But if you can develop those skills and have a program for that, then that could be another category that, and much fewer jobs, but better quality jobs. So I think that's quite promising. So that would probably not be happening at a level, Research One level university such as ours, but it might be happening in a community college system. So, anything else?
Good. I'd like to thank very much Nancey for an excellent presentation. Thank you to everybody for participating. This is very appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks.